morning, guys. Sorry I was a few minutes late getting started today. Thank you all for waiting for me. All right. So, good morning, folks. Normally, we have a few minutes before class starts to look at a screen. Obviously, we didn't have that this morning because I was running a little late. But this is a photo that was taken by a woman who was doing research in the Arctic, and they were told there was a polar bear in the area, but they hadn't seen it. So she took a lot of pictures of the hills around where they were working to see if, you know, when she got back to the lab, she could find one. And she did. And it's right here. And I don't know about you, but that's a big freaking animal. If you look at the size of the trees that are closer to us, that's scary big. Polar bears are one of the few animals that I'm quite happy never seen in the wild. Okay, so as usual, we have a quiz and a journal entry due this Friday before midnight. And I want to remind you guys, the project will be due Sunday, April 30th. So that's a little more than a month from now. So you've got just about a month to get that done. Does anybody have any questions about the presentation or the project? I'm sorry, for you guys, it's the project. Any questions on that before we get into the material?
I'm all set.
Okay, good. All right, so we've been talking about the Black Death, specifically the second plague pandemic. And last time we talked about the idea that the plague was caused by an imbalance of humors or possibly by miasma, which literally means bad air. So because there was no understanding of germ theory, different people had different ideas of what was going on. And so the next thing I want to talk about, the idea that plague is a punishment from God. So religious-based concepts. One is the one that I just mentioned. Plague is a punishment of God. Obviously, other people would think it was sent by the devil. The people who thought it was a punishment from God thought that God sent the plague because of moral failings of people. The idea was that if you were a good person, you would not get the plague. If your society was a good society, you would not get the plague, or your society would not get the plague. So how can we treat something that was sent by God to punish us? So one of the things that would happen, you're trying to placate the divine wrath. So you're trying to make God happy with you. So let's start with casting out or punishing people with poor morals. So how do we define poor morals? Well, you've probably experienced modern religious groups who have some odd ideas about poor morals. At the time, the sins were included drinking alcohol, overeating or gluttony, excess sleep, idleness, So you sleep too much, you're too lazy. Immoderate, unnatural, or sinful sex. This is still a popular one among a lot of religious groups. Immoderate means you're having sex too much or outside of the marriage situation. Unnatural, this would be anything other than penis and vagina sex between a married couple. Or sinful sex. Again, it's the same kind of concept here. Basically, we're saying sex is basically evil, and the only people who should have it are married husband and wife, and they should have it for the purposes of having babies. Obviously, we don't, thank goodness, believe that anymore. And a lot of people at the time certainly didn't believe it. No society in all of history has ever actually behaved that way. Sex drive is a powerful biological imperative. It's, for most people, fun and entertaining, and trying to tell people not to do it, yeah, it doesn't really work. We're seeing that today, though. We're seeing that in the United States with all of these laws against trans people, and it's probably going to extend to pushing back against the legalization of homosexuality and homosexual marriage. So that is something to be concerned about. They also thought that God was mad because of blasphemous religious practices or beliefs. Blasphemous religious practices or beliefs are basically, our church knows the right way to do things. We believe in the correct God and we worship him the correct way, and everybody else is wrong. So we do see that some today. We don't see that quite as much in public as we used to back in this time period. Certainly, I have known people who believed this way. I lost a very good friend in high school because she joined a church. And the church was a religious, it was an extremist church, probably bordering on cult. And she had to quit being friends with me because I was evil and going to hell because I wore makeup. So you do still see some of this today. So that is the sin-based part of it. But there's also the part of it where we have to placate the divine wrath. So we know who the sinners are. They're people who drink alcohol. They're people who sleep a lot. They're people who have sex or who have the wrong religious practices. So in response to this, the people who were on the right side of God, as decided by themselves, would torture or kill people that they believed were sinners. This would include things like cutting off hands, burning at the stake, and stoning. So burning at the stake, we all think of that when we think of the burning witches, but it wasn't just witches who were being burned during the medieval period. It was all kinds of people who were believed to be sinners. And stoning to death is exactly what it sounds like. They would usually tie the person up somehow, and then everybody in the community would come by and throw stones. So that's one group that was to blame. The other group, okay, the next group we're going to talk about is women. So women were believed to be the blame for a lot of so-called sinful practices. They were the source of bringing men into incorrect sexuality. It's women's responsibility to hold the moral ground, right? But in England, there was a problem with what were called at the time tournament groupies. So this was just in England, as far as I can tell. And these tournament groupies, the tournaments at the time were things like jousting and sword fighting and that kind of stuff. And the women would dress in men's clothing. They would mount on horses with one leg on each side of the horse, and then they would attend these tournaments. As far as I can tell, they weren't, I'm sure some of them were, but they weren't in mass participating, but they appeared to be men, and they went to these events that were only for men to go to. So that's, obviously going to bring down the wrath of God and the plague. Who else are we going to blame? The Jewish people. This is a wrong religion. So when we talk about anti-Semitism, there were rumors that the Jews were poisoning wells. So they were putting poison in wells to kill the good Christians. This is also when the rumors about the Jewish people killing Jesus became rampant, which kind of puzzles me, because if Jesus wasn't killed on the cross, he died on the cross to atone for our sins. So how could he atone for our sins if he hadn't been killed? That's a logical argument that I just don't understand. They supposedly were conspiring to get rid of the Christians. The Jewish people at the time were not as likely to get the plague. This is true. They didn't get the plague in as high of a numbers, in part because they had better hygiene. And so they weren't, if they were reusing clothing, they cleaned it better than other groups. If they reused bedding, they cleaned it better than other groups. So that helped reduce the amount of fleas that were being passed from person to person with bedding and with clothing. And that's going to reduce the risk of plague right there. Jewish people were often tortured, told that they must convert to Christianity. If they didn't convert to Christianity, they were murdered. And of course, it's not just the sinners, the women, the Jews. It was also things like foreigners, witches, which is a very vague term, right? The poor, or as I put in my notes, impoverished. So people who weren't able to support themselves and would beg on the streets. We see similar things going on today. I know you guys are mostly on the East Coast. I live out here in California. And one of the things that's going on out here right now is they're trying to get rid of the homelessness problem, not so much by helping the people who are homeless, helping them find housing and jobs and, kick any drug habits they may have, get psychiatric help if they need it, but by going through and basically cleaning out the places that they live. and taking away all their belongings. I'm really not sure how that's going to end the homelessness problem. It's just going to make things worse for them. So throughout history, we tend to hate the same people over and over and over again. So that's one side of the religious argument, trying to placate the divine wrath by kicking out of the community anybody who might be bringing the plague or causing the plague or torturing and killing them. The other side of the religious argument would be the piety cults. So these people also felt that plague and the Black Death were sent by God, and God was angry with us. But instead of going after other people, they practiced penance and self-abasement. So literally, they're trying to do things themselves in order to make God happy. The kinds of things that they would do would be processions to holy sites. So they would literally walk long distance to a holy shrine. They would go to confession a lot. One of the things they would do would be to walk for 40 days. So 40 days and 40 nights is originally it was an idiom or a saying that meant for a very, very long time, nobody knew quite how long. It got interpreted as literally 40 days. And you'll find it in lots of different places in the Bible. So a lot of these piety cults would walk for 40 days, sometimes dragging crosses with them. Sometimes they would do self-flagellation. Flagellation is basically physically harming yourself. And the most popular tool would be this guy. This is a cat o' nine tails. And you've got 9 strands coming out of the stick, 9 strands with a nice little knot at the end. And there would usually be pieces of metal embedded in that knot. So this would be used, literally they would beat themselves, usually on the back, causing themselves to bleed and feel pain as an attempt to say, look, God, we know we're evil and we've done horrible things and you've sent this plague. So look, I'm hurting myself so you don't need to hurt me. We also saw a lot of asceticism, not quite sure how to pronounce that one, but this is self-denial. So this kind of stuff would be no drinking, no having sex. In fact, a lot of these men, and they were usually men, avoided women. Eating small portions, so literally barely eating enough to keep themselves alive. Not necessarily, you might do things like not build a fire at night. So you would sleep in a cold room and you would literally be cold all night just to, deny yourself the comfort of a good night's sleep. We would also see a lot of praying to saints. So in 1681, the city of Venice was going through a really nasty plague pandemic, and they prayed to the Virgin Mary and promised that if she would remove the plague from their society, they would build a church in her honor, and have yearly processions to that church. Well, the plague declined. It always does. It comes and it goes. Venice built this massive church in her honor. And to this day, they still have yearly processions to the church to thank her for taking the plague away in 1681. So we've got these ideas that, we can either torture other people, we can essentially torture ourselves trying to appease God. And then you have the other people. Okay, God sent the plague. There's nothing we can do about it. We're all going to die anyway. And so some people, in response to the plague, binged on everything, eating huge amounts of food, drinking large amounts of alcohol, having lots and lots of sex, doing the bar crawl. But they kept doing it over and over because they were convinced that they were going to die anyway, and they might as well, enjoy themselves. So that's the religious side of it. I mentioned that other people said it was a demonic curse. It's kind of the same concept here. Instead of God sending it, demons are sending it. And you got similar reactions if you believed this idea as opposed to divine wrath. If you believed it was a demonic curse, you could try and drive out or kill those people who were bringing the curse to your community. And the people bringing the curse could be people who were sick, but it could also be, it's that group of people and not us. We're not bringing the plague. We're catching the plague from these other people, foreigners, sinners, Jewish people, beggars, women, any of those groups. And so they ended up doing a lot of the same things that the religious groups were doing to try and get rid of this curse. We also see just generalized superstition, ideas that the stars were out of alignment. That was one. There was an idea that certain metals or precious stones could offer protection. We still see this, right? There are people who are trying to sell clothing like underwear that has copper metal in it because it's supposed to, I'm not quite sure what it's supposed to do, but it's supposed to protect you from all kinds of ills. People who believe in crystals think precious stones offer protection. We're still seeing these kinds of concepts in certain people today. And this is where some of those started from. This is where some of those concepts began. And the number 4 was considered special. So when we think about this, we had the 4 humors, the 4 seasons, the 4 winds, which basically means the 4 directions. Not every society divides things up into 4s. This is kind of a European thing. Other societies have a different number of seasons, different numbers of directions, but number 4 was considered special. We named so many different things based on this. And so you might try and live at house number 4. You might try and surround yourself with things in 4s. So this was an idea that would help protect you from the plague by having a lot of things related to the number 4 around. Regardless of what people believed, we were seeing a lot of flight from cities to countryside. We saw this at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Rich people would leave the cities and go to their country house. This happened back during the plague as well. And the rich people took their doctors with them. So the cities where the illness was did not have as many doctors as they did before the plague pandemic started. So people were sick in large numbers, and there weren't as many doctors. If you're paying attention, we're seeing similar problems now. We're seeing shortages of nurses and doctors in hospitals all around, probably the world, but certainly all around the US. And part of it is people leaving the profession. Part of it is, I'm sorry to say, these people were more likely to be exposed to COVID. Therefore, they died in higher numbers than the general populace. But the plague was so terrifying to these people at this time. Remember, this was much, much deadlier than COVID. So the horror broke the common bonds of humanity. So I'm going to read you a quote from Giovanni Boccaccio from the Decameron. Tedious were it to recount how citizen avoided citizen, how among neighbors was scarce found any that showed fellow feeling for another, how kinfolk held aloft and never met, or but rarely. Enough that this sore affliction entered so deep into the minds of men and women that in the horror thereof, brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by uncle, brother by sister, and oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited, to their fate, as if they had been strangers. Wherefore the sick of both sexes, whose number could not be estimated, were left without resource, but in the charity of friends, and few such there were, or the interest of servants, who were hardly to be had at high rates and on unseemly terms. So the idea here was that because it was so contagious, because it was killing such a high percentage of the people who were infected, people were not willing to take care of their sick relatives, even their own children, because they were afraid that they were going to catch it and die. And so people who had money could hire servants at very high wages to take care of them while they were sick. But, you know, that's only for the rich. The poor people were just, you know, out of luck. And so some of the mortality, I am sure, was because people were so sick they weren't able to feed themselves. They weren't able to get water. And so they're going to be dehydrated, and that's going to increase the fatality rate here. So when we're talking about this pandemic, let me remind you again that this pandemic, the Black Death specifically, killed off, I'm trying to remember. Here we go. Nope, that's the wrong one. Trying to remember off the top of my head, but it was like a quarter of the world population. And most of the people who died, it was really focused in on Europe and the Middle East. It wasn't as widespread. It didn't seem to get to the New World. We're not sure about Asia. We're really not sure about Africa. But based just on the deaths from Europe and the Middle East, at least a quarter of the world's population were killed off during the Black Death, which was only about 5 years long. So it's understandable that people were horrified and reacted very badly. I would argue that if you had a bunch of children, say you had 4 children and 1 child got sick, you might run away with the other 3 hoping to save their lives. Because everybody believed that, well, it was largely high fatality rate here. So because so many people were dying, the graveyards filled. Literally, they were running out of places to bury their dead. So we shifted from individual graves to mass graves. These are now called plague pits, and they are common when people are doing construction work in Europe. They will sometimes come across plague pits. If you're doing archaeological research, finding a large number of skeletons in a common area, that tells you what time period it was. It was the Black Death period. That's a way to help get a good estimate of the when those people were buried, because that's the most common cause of mass deaths in Europe. Now, we've seen mass deaths or mass graves in more modern times due to warfare. But during the Black Death, if it was a mass grave or a plague pit, it was plague. So the priest would be leading a procession to the graveyard, and they would be leading the procession with 1 or 2 deceased, and people would keep joining the procession. And so by the time they would get to the graveyard, they might have a dozen bodies that had to be buried. And if the bodies were being carried in a cart, they might have just been put on the cart. They might not have people going along with them. So they might not even know who these people were. The normal funerary practices faltered. There were not enough people to clean the dead and perform the normal funeral rites. So instead, there started to be large numbers of people buried at funerals in a mass grave with a quick public mourning. So people might stand around and mourn their loved ones, and then they're gone. These really quick burials started to produce the fear of being buried alive, which was a valid concern during this time period. Before the Black Death, people, after they died, would be laid out until the body started to clearly decay, so that they knew the person was dead before they buried them. During the Black Death, it was kind of like, oh, they look dead, throw them in the pit. There's a Monty Python sketch on this one. People also feared for their souls because they couldn't receive last rites. Last rites is a tradition in some churches where the priest comes, here's a final confession, absolves you of all your sins, and then you're kind of guaranteed a slot in heaven. People were afraid that they were going to go to hell because there weren't enough priests to handle the mass numbers of people dying. This depopulation in Europe resulted a few years later in actually increased wages. We're kind of getting a hint that this is going on in the US right now. We lost a significant percentage of our working population during COVID, and we have a significant percentage of our working population who are now to some degree disabled because of long COVID. And so companies are having trouble getting workers. Well, they're having trouble getting workers because they're not willing to pay them. And so I think we're going to start seeing increased wages in the next few years, as long as, we all kind of hold the line and insist on them. Landowners used to rent out their land to tenant farmers. And nowadays, or after this mass depopulation in Europe, we started seeing them accepting labor or accepting a portion of the crops rather than accepting money. So that's kind of the short term what was going on. In the longer term, remember, this second pandemic peaked in the 1300s, but lasted from 1346 to the late 18th century. So it lasted hundreds of years. After the Black Death, outbreaks happened. They would happen in various regions, but they didn't become as widespread as the Black Death. This was the same strain of Yersinia pestis. So it wasn't that the Yersinia evolved, but it did show up being less severe and less frequent over time. A lot of this is that the survivors of the Black Death were more likely to have genetic changes to their immune system that helped them survive the Black Death, which means that they survive, they reproduce, the next generation is more likely to have these genetic mutations that help them survive the Black Death. Here comes another wave of plague. The survivors again were selecting those people who have the most inherent genetic characteristics that allowed them to survive. Most of these outbreaks in Europe came along trade routes, especially from what we now call the Middle East, what was then called the Near East. So it seemed to become kind of established in the rodent populations in that area and would move out from there periodically. Okay, so horrible times, horrible responses, lots of, we had a lot of people dying from the disease. We also had a lot of people dying because they were being blamed and murdered. On the plus side, in response to the Black Death, we have the beginnings of what's called public health, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries. So not during the early parts of the second plague pandemic, but later on, we start seeing government-issued plague regulations and what were called health magistrates that had strong legal, legislative, and judicious powers. So they had a lot of legislative power. So they had powers to create laws and enforce them. Remember, this is well before germ theory, but it was when we started understanding to some degree that plague was being passed from person to person, and it could be passed from rats to humans. Public health is different than individual health. When you go to your doctor, that is your health that is being addressed. It is an individual health evaluation and treatment. Public health is not looking for the good of the individual, it's looking for the good of the society or the community. What can we do to reduce the risk that more people in the society will get sick? What can we do to protect our society against these diseases? That is public health. And we're going to start by talking about the 1600s, that's the 17th century, and these structures called lazarettos. So a lot of outbreaks were occurring in the Mediterranean region. And the Office of Health in Venice had the job of protecting the city from plague that was arriving on ships. Fortunately for Venice, there were lots of islands in the lagoon of Venice. So there were lots of little islands in there, and these islands had these structures built that were called lazarettos. This is the remains of one of those lazarettos. Lazarettos were basically quarantine facilities. So ships that were coming in that the Office of Health thought might be carrying the plague would have to be impounded at one of these islands. The ship would have to be scrubbed and fumigated. Fumigation would kill the rats and any insects like fleas on the ship. Largely, it was using smoke for fumigation. The crews and the passengers were quarantined and isolated under guard. So they were being held whether they wanted to be or not. They had to pay for their own, depending on the city, the ship might have to pay for housing and feeding the crew. In Venice, the government of Venice was paying to house and feed the crew. The cargo would be pulled off the ship, laid out in the sun, and again fumigated. And the quarantine period lasted for 40 days. The 40 days, again, were coming from the Bible, from religious beliefs. And our modern day word quarantine comes from this. The Italian word quaranta, probably butchering the pronunciation, please forgive me, which meant 40. Because ships would try and avoid quarantine, they would try and sneak around, we started having navies. So this was kind of the origin of having a navy as well. There was a lot of economic things to consider, administrative details to consider, military support to consider. So it was expensive for the cities. The good part was that 40 days in quarantine worked really well. This is longer than the incubation period of plague. So remember, incubation period had along between exposure and symptoms. So how long would it take to develop these symptoms? If people were healthy after 40 days, they didn't have the plague. 40 days also was longer than infected fleas can survive. So this meant that any infected fleas would die during that 40 days. And 40 days with nobody on the ship, everything was taken off the ship, the rats were going to leave the ship. So the shipboard rats would also scatter. Quarantine is not a perfect system, but it did definitely reduce outbreaks. This worked great if you had islands where you could quarantine the people, if you had a lot of ocean surrounding your area, so that was where most of the people showed in. When you tried to do land-based quarantines, or what were called sanitary cordons. Sanitary cordons basically means a barrier to prevent people who were infected from coming into your community. These were much, much harder to enforce. Generally, these were only tried or put into practice when there was an ongoing outbreak. But you would often have vigilantes, people who took it on themselves to arm themselves and protect their community. We often have those people patrolling city walls. During this time period, most cities were surrounded by a wall. It was largely to help protect the community from violent people coming in from outside. Marauders, invaders of various sorts, common criminals that might form giant gangs, that sort of thing. But the more the population increases, the more countries developed, then we started having national borders, and we started having troops at intervals to create or form this sanitary cordon. The idea being you would have to go past these troops to get into the country, and the troops wouldn't let you in. The church supported these ideas. They said that anybody who snuck past a border would be excommunicated or kicked out of the church. Now, here's the problem. Do border patrols work? No, they basically don't. They might reduce the number of people coming into a country, but they don't stop it. So one of the early sanitary cordons was produced by the Austrian military. So Austria is kind of up here in this part of Europe. Again, this is the Mediterranean, England, Spain, France. So Austria would be about here. They had a sanitary cordon 10 to 20 miles wide. Not long, but wide. So there was a 10 to 20 miles between Austria and any other country that you were not allowed to cross. Their military force was up to 150,000 men. All male peasants, peasants is a nice word for poor people, were conscripted. So if you were poor in Austria and you were male, congratulations, you just joined the military. When an emergency would be declared, the emergencies were usually outbreaks in the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire in the early 1700s was huge. It was the big empire at that time period. And so it had Greece, it had Turkey, it had parts of Egypt, Northern Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of the Near East. Really a huge empire for the time period. So when there was an outbreak in the Ottoman Empire, anybody caught crossing the border could be tried and sentenced on the spot. So the troops, the military, if they caught you trying to cross the border, they would go, you're trying to smuggle people across the border, you're trying to sneak across the border yourselves, we're going to have a military trial right here, right now. If you're found guilty, death by firing squad. This wasn't very popular. Oh, I misspelled Austria really badly here. This wasn't popular with the Austrian people. And it eventually ended. People would refuse to participate. There was lots of internal pressure. If all the male peasants were being used to protect the border, who was doing the work that they would normally be doing? Tending the farms and that sort of stuff. Well, it was either the women or the wealthier classes. You know, it wasn't the wealthier classes. Plus, plague kind of declined in the Ottoman Empire, no longer became endemic, no longer became the basic source of new outbreaks. So that ended that sanitary cordon. And of course, if plague got into the countries, then the Board of Health would try and seek out the sick and the dead and take those to lazarettos, basically quarantine facilities, or more colloquially or more casually, these were referred to as pest houses. So these were hospitals for the sick people. And frankly, plague was pretty deadly. The care in most of these lazarettos or pest houses was very poor, and few people would return from them. In some locations, confinement was basically a death sentence, and it had to be enforced legally and by armed guards. There were severe penalties for escape attempts, which were common. In addition to that, the people who were being quarantined in these pest houses were being charged for their room and board. If your family couldn't pay for your room and board, you're not getting fed. God, times were rough back then. The sites were also sometimes used as jails. So not only were sick people being locked up in pest houses, but criminals were being locked up too. And these searchers, these people who were looking for sick people, they were allowed to enter people's houses and search them. It was legal for them to do this. And of course, this caused a lot of hostility. There was danger for the people who were searching for the sick because, you know, people might try and defend their houses, fight you off. You might also be exposed to the plague yourself. So many of the people who were doing this jobs would be fortified with alcohol. So part of your job, you might get alcohol to help you, encourage you to do this work. And bribes were really common. So you could bribe these searchers to pass your house by. If that didn't happen, the people searching your house might steal from you. So that was common. There were some locations where there were, we're going to call them plague hospitals instead of pest houses, where the patients were supported. They got medical care, such as it was. They got people tending to their religious, spiritual, and emotional needs. So you could get a priest to come and give you your last rites. You could get somebody who would sit with you and read from your religious text, or even just talk to you. The idea in these plague hospitals was that fear and anger cause imbalance of humors and reduce the likelihood of recovery. These were often funded, fully funded, so the people who were coming to these plague hospitals didn't have to pay for room and board. Once again, Venice led the way. The head of the plague hospital would be called the prior, and that was usually a powerful and well-respected position. The prior's wife would also work at the hospital. The prior would be in charge of the medical needs of the adults. The wife would be in charge of the medical needs of the children. Carts were used to carry the dead away, and they had bells to warn the public that they were coming through with plague victims. During outbreaks, the dead would increase in numbers so that the carts could not keep up, and the corpses would be dumped into hastily dug pits or mass funeral pyres. So they would burn the dead. Even though these plague outbreaks would occur over and over and over again, a lot of major outbreaks caught cities unprepared. They weren't ready for another outbreak. You know, they didn't want to believe it was going to happen. They wanted to believe that the plague was over and it wasn't going to come through again. And if they didn't have the plague hospitals, if they didn't have pest hospitals, they might quarantine you in your own house. And if they quarantined you in your own home, they would mark your door, usually with a cross in red, and there would be a guard posted. And the family was forced to stay inside. Nobody was allowed in, nobody was allowed out, which means you had to survive on the food that you had in the house. You had to survive without medical care, and you were stuck inside with someone with the plague. These draconian efforts to stop these outbreaks, people did not respond well to it. I mean, look at the US in COVID. We did not respond well to things. We responded well at first to things shutting down, but it didn't last very long. And nowadays, trying to get people to wear masks in public, it makes people make it out to be like you're asking them to, you know, give up some important civil liberty rather than wear a piece of cloth over their face. We have to wear shoes and we have to cover our genitals in public. Masks should not be considered a big ask. But in the Black Death, we get resistance, we get riots, we get people hiding cases. This led to a lack of potentially useful information, which we're seeing nowadays in the US as well. In 1896, there was an outbreak in what was then known as Bombay, what is now known as Mumbai in India. The outbreak started in September. By December, half of the population had fled, not died of the plague, fled the city. And it wasn't because of the plague, it was by the fear and the harsh mechanisms the government was trying to use to stop the plague from spreading. So what do you think happened? Some of those people fleeing carried the plague to their other communities, and so it spread and became a bigger outbreak. The city was affected by plague. When we kind of look over the overview of what we see as a result of the plague, loss of community and family bonds. We saw churches closing. We saw the economy coming to a halt. People were not buying things just to buy things. There was a real risk of hunger and economic ruin. Think about it. If you're traveling and you're carrying food from one place to another and the city wants you to wait outside for 40 days, most food's going to go bad during that 40 days. It's not really a good solution there. We also saw a rise in authoritarian rule. Unless the government was destroyed by illness or by the officials fleeing or by rebellions. So that kind of gives you a picture of the kinds of things that were going on during the second plague pandemic and the kind of lives people were living during this second plague pandemic. Okay, and I was running late, so I probably talked insanely quick today, and I didn't give you guys time to come in with questions if you had any. I apologize again. Does anybody have any questions about what we covered today?
Do you know like what the time frame was when like there started to be major improvements in like the plague, like when it started kind of like getting better?
Yes, I do. So the Black Death itself was only a few years long. After that, after the mid, hang on, let me remember my dates again. After the mid to late 1300s, things certainly did get better. More people would survive the plague when it came through. We're going to really talk about that next time. We're going to talk about all of the different things that led to a slow and gradual improvement in conditions. It wasn't like there was a firm date that we can say this is the last day of the second pandemic, because it just kind of gradually declined and then dwindled out. Other questions? Okay, we're going to stop there then, and we're going to talk about, next time we're going to talk about how the second plague pandemic declined. We're going to talk briefly about the third plague pandemic, and then we're going to talk about research into the plague and how the bacteria was discovered initially and how we developed germ theory. All right. If there aren't any more questions, I'm going to call it a day.
Have a great weekend.
Okay.
And week.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Yes.
much.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.